I'm going to turn now to CBS News Radio correspondent Bill Rehkopf, who joins us on the phone. He's been a volunteer firefighter for the past 30 years. Bill, can you give us some insight into what these firefighters are up against and how a fire like this is particularly difficult to fight?
Well, I'll tell you, Tanya, church fires in general are really hard to fight, whether it's a smaller church with a big nave in it or if it's something to this level of a cathedral. And it almost seems as if, and I'm not there, but just looking at it, as if the die was probably cast by the time firefighters arrived. I mean, that fire was high up on the roof. It presented a logistical challenge. The cathedral itself sits on an island in the middle of the Seine River. It may have been difficult to get apparatus into position, particularly the aerial pieces that need to put water on that fire up on top. You could try to go inside and do something with it, but with all of the flammable material inside a church and with those old timbers that build up and comprise the trusses of the roof, they go up like tinder, and you don't want to put your people in the road of anything that might collapse. So it was one of those situations where perhaps you get into the situation, you right off the roof and hope you can save what's inside.
We've been following this fire since the earliest images were coming across, and it appeared from what we could see that the fire started pretty high up. It was either on the roof or on the spire. What does that tell you?
Well, I mean, that's where we first saw it. So we don't know exactly where the fire started. It's still possible it might have started inside the building and vetted its way outside, or, it may have been the construction materials on the roof. It may have just been a coincidence. Right now, we don't know, and the investigators are going to look very, very closely at that once they get everything under control and are able to interview the people who were there and around the scene. But yes, the fact that the fire started way up high makes it so hard. The other factor here was the wind. If you saw those earlier pictures, where that fire started near that old beautiful spire, the wind was pushing toward the front of the cathedral, and it was a heavy wind. You could see that from the column of smoke that was just being pushed toward the front. That was also bad news for firefighters, because instead of burning toward the back where they might have been able to contain it and try to keep the front of the building secure, the wind pushed that fire along the roof line up to the iconic bell towers.
Now, in your experience as a firefighter, when you're talking about wood, this old, 300-year-old wood, could something, as insignificant as a tossed cigarette be able to cause damage like this?
Oh, certainly. And whether it's somebody working on a roof or somebody outside of their house, casually throwing a cigarette into a potted plant next to vinyl siding, which is like liquid gasoline when it catches fire, from the smallest of sparks. And we've seen this with the wildfires out west. You can see such devastation. And that's why, firefighters are always preaching prevention and awareness about where you're doing things. So, again, we don't know if a smoking or the construction materials or maybe an electrical problem played a role. These are all things we're going to find out in the days and weeks to come. But, firefighters really had their hands full when they got here today. And certainly this is one that they'll go back and they'll talk about for the rest of their careers.
Yeah, I would imagine. And when you're looking at these pictures, I don't know if you're seeing the same live images that we are. What does it tell you? How far does this fire look from being put out?
So it looks like now, and from what we're being told by officials, is that the entire roof structure between where the spire stood and the bell towers has collapsed into the cathedral itself. And that's, one of the worst case scenarios, because now you've got the fire and you've got the timbers and you've got the wreckage down into the nave of the building. And that's where all of the artifacts and the works of art are that people are so concerned about, and justifiably so. And firefighters are going to be mindful of that. If there was an opportunity to get in and try to rescue some of those, they would most certainly do it. But you're also talking about large statues. You're talking about huge religious artifacts that would have been impossible to remove. So even if they were able to get some of that stuff out, you look at the picture like this and see now the fire is burning deep in. It almost looks like it's a giant fire pit at this point. You don't see the visible flame. It's all down inside the building, burning the debris that's down in there. And I'm just afraid that the losses are just going to be tragic.
Oh, and it would be far too difficult or dangerous to send, firefighters into that situation, wouldn't it?
Yes, absolutely. I recall in my hometown in the city of Pittsburgh a few years ago, they had a large church with a bell tower catch on fire, and much the same way, the roof burned off. It went down into the floor and into the basement of the building. And as firefighters were operating around the outside, one thing you have to take into account now is the integrity of the structure of those stone walls. The stone's not going to build, but don't forget, you don't have the trusses holding them together anymore. They may have been weakened by the heat, some of the seams. And what happened in Pittsburgh was there was a giant collapse of the bell tower, and tragically, 2 firefighters were killed. So even though that fire's down in the pit right now, firefighters are going to keep their distance. They're going to keep a safe perimeter. They want to watch those bell towers carefully and also those large historic stone walls to make sure that they're not in a collapse zone.
So you're saying that those stone walls could very well, by the time all is said and done, they could very well collapse?
They could. It's a concern, but we've seen other pictures, and I mean, think about the school books you looked at of some of the great cathedrals and churches that burned during World War II and were left to be shells, not just in Britain but across Europe. That's likely what we're going to see here. Is you're going to see, and again, because they're stone, they retain heat, so it turns that into a large, in effect, a Dutch oven inside there, and we'll keep the heat and we'll keep the fire going. But there are potentials for areas of those walls to have been weakened, and I'm not talking about necessarily a complete collapse, but you have to watch out for pieces of those walls, and even if it's just a small piece with that stone, it could be deadly.
Bill Rehkopf, CBS News Radio correspondent and volunteer firefighter for the past 30 years. We thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you, Tanya.